Hi guys, the title of the title you see on the screen today. Don't forget to like and subscribe and we'll get started. This story originates from one girl who came to the market to buy some food for herself. She approached a woman who was selling various fruits and vegetables, and taking a red apple in her hand, she calculated that she would pay 2 bronze coins for 5 of them. And if she has correctly calculated the cost of the medicine for her sister, that means she only has 1 bronze coin left. No doubt these apples are not as good as the ones she once ate, but she still wants to bring some for her sick little sister. The girl also thought she had lost a lot of weight from eating the horrible soup every day. Then she thought of asking the saleswoman to sell her 2 apples for 1 coin, but the woman, suddenly angry, asked that she should pick already quickly, because it was only her who was delaying her. The girl immediately held out the apple and apologized to her, making her feel very embarrassed about the whole situation. She thought about how if only their father hadn't left them so early, things like this wouldn't be so hard. Or if their mother was still alive, she could even, perhaps, enjoy her life. But Violetta quickly pushed such thoughts away from herself, because she realized that they would not lead to anything good and would not help her in any way. She had to think positively. The girl had to focus first and foremost on finding a job so that she could support the only family she had left at all. However, Violetta did not understand where she could find a job at all, because almost everyone does not want to accept employees. The times are hard, so even adults have a hard time finding a good position. However, at that moment, while she was standing there contemplating how many apples to take after all, some guy came up to her and snatched one, immediately starting to eat it. She looked at him in surprise and wondered who he was, and more importantly, why he had taken the apple away from her. The girl really didn't know who this guy was and how he could eat fruit without even paying. She then shifted her gaze, scrutinizing his appearance, and realized that he didn't look like someone who had a lot of money. The stranger continued to calmly chew himself an apple, when suddenly the saleswoman saw this and began to immediately yell at him, asking what he was even doing. She said he couldn't eat unless he paid and wondered if he had absolutely no common sense. The boy stopped at that moment, but still continued to remain silent. Then the saleswoman, continuing to shout, said that, as she could see, he was completely unaffected. But this stranger held out the bitten apple to Violetta, who still stood very much surprised, and said that she must also eat it. The saleswoman was still incredibly angry and said they couldn't do it under her supervision. She started to walk away from her counter and said she was going to call the guards, because she didn't understand how he dared to steal her apple in the first place. Violetta immediately started looking around and told the saleswoman that she didn't know the guy at all, and certainly not with him. But when she shifted her gaze to the stranger, she noticed that he looked clean and refined, just like a real nobleman. But he behaved like a barbarian. He was silent for a while and then, holding out the apple again, said it was quite tasty and wondered why she wouldn't take some. Violetta was very panicky and explained that she would not eat it because they had not paid for it. He then asked if she had to be fed in order to taste it. The girl realized he was serious, so she took the apple in her hands and said she could do it herself. But as soon as she looked at him, she couldn't decide to eat him without paying. She could feel the gaze of this unknown bully on her, and it made her even more uncomfortable. Violetta could feel him breathing down her neck to make sure she was really eating that apple. She thought that was just unbelievable, and decided it was best to never mess with this strange guy again. Then she took a bite of the fruit. She decided she didn't want to get into any trouble, so she would just eat it, pay afterward, and leave as soon as possible because of this horrible place. But at the moment when the apple began to give out its aroma and taste in her mouth, the girl realized that it was simply excellent, and such delicious she had not eaten for a long time. The boy, on the other hand, continued to watch her eat that apple. He even blushed a little. After taking a few more bites, Violetta said that he didn't have to worry, because she would pay for it. She wanted to buy some apples anyway, so she had already decided to pay for that too. She decided to think rather optimistically, but at that moment the saleswoman and her guards came in and, pointing a finger at them, said that they were there, those thieves, standing right outside her shop. But as soon as Violetta took a closer look at the uniforms of these guards, she could not understand why it was the knights who had come instead. It wasn't even 1 or 2 of them. but as many as 6 had come to find out what was going on, and the girl was very much frightened by it. So, as soon as they came closer, she even began to shake with fear. Violetta turned to them and said she was really sorry. She wanted to pay for that apple right now. But then suddenly, a blonde-haired boy came up to them. He addressed the stranger who was standing next to the girl, calling him his brother, and asked why he had changed his clothes again and run away. This man looked very gorgeous in his military uniform and said with a slight smile. His vassals came running to him in terror when they heard about it. As soon as Violetta heard this, she immediately looked at the stranger in surprise. She couldn't believe that this guy was really his brother. The girl could not realize what they were talking about, because it all looked very strange to her. But then suddenly, looking more closely at the uniform of the handsome fellow who approached them, she noticed the crest of the continent of Dennet on his sleeve. And she immediately realized that this all meant that this guy must be pretty popular. So the girl immediately shifted her gaze to the side and looked at the stranger with blonde hair and blue eyes, and realized that it was Theobald Dennet. There were many rumors about the tragedy that occurred after 5 years of the Countess's departure. The eldest son, who had a rather promising and bright future, was even to be appointed heir. But he ended up having a pretty big and tragic incident with it, namely a transportation accident. He was badly damaged afterwards, and after that, he became a completely insane person. His memories were lost, and eventually the guy became hypersensitive and wouldn't even let anyone near him. Violetta had only heard of these twins through rumors that had been floating around the city at one point. However, this man was right next to her right now, and it was incredibly surprising and even frightening to her in a way. The blonde-haired guy who was in uniform told his brother to just end this whole concert already and go back to the castle as soon as possible. Theobald then, turning to him, inquired since when he was his brother at all, but the man only sighed heavily and told all the people present that he didn't remember him again, so he asked that the guards take and bring him to the castle by themselves. Men immediately began to surround the blonde-haired boy in order to help him get home. Violetta, who stayed by his side, said she was only a stranger and didn't even know anything about him, so she asked to be let go and would go on about her business. The girl was well aware that she had to leave this place as soon as possible, and when she tried to do so, the man grabbed her arm and pulled her closer to him. Violetta looked at him in surprise, not understanding why he had suddenly stopped her and pulled her close. She didn't understand anything at all, so she turned to the man and asked if he could let her go, because she needed to get home as soon as possible. But Theobald, when he heard these words, only squeezed her hand even harder and then smiled happily. The girl didn't understand what it was with him in general and why he wouldn't let her go, and she needed to leave as soon as possible. The man, however, only continued to hold her hand and led her away. The guards stood for a while in bewilderment and then followed them. Some time passed from that moment, and they came to the manor. Theobald's brother immediately began to deal with the girl and wondered if she really claimed to be a complete stranger to him. Violetta, who was standing opposite, said that everything was quite right. She had seen this man for the first time that day. She really hoped it wouldn't last long, and she would soon be able to go home. But the man only scrutinized her appearance and wondered if her words were true. He began to examine her carefully and noticed that the girl's clothes at first glance looked shabby and old, but if you looked at her style in general, you could see that she was from a noble family. Despite the fact that the clothes had been completely out of fashion for quite some time, they were still kept in pretty good condition. He remained silent for some time longer, and then, turning to Violetta, said that in that case they should apologize to her for what had happened. He explained that his brother really liked her for some reason, and that was the reason he thought they had known each other before. The girl was about to say why that might be, but thought about the fact that he probably thought it was pathetic and intriguing at the same time. The fact that she had thought twice about buying just one apple. The man, smiling, said that was indeed true, and it didn't matter at all what the reason for all this would be. But at that moment, their conversation was interrupted. There was a knock on the room, addressing Lord David, and saying that it was Isaac, and inquiring if they might enter. The man was a little surprised, but allowed it to be done. Then the butler came into the room and bowed immediately before the gentleman. He continued to be silent for a while until David replied that it was okay, and he could say what happened, even in front of this girl. Isaac was a little surprised, and said it was because Lord Theobald had disappeared again. When his brother heard that, He sighed heavily and couldn't believe it had happened again. He was silent for a while, and then inquired of the butler how many times he had already done this, and Isaac immediately replied that this was the 17th such occasion. Violetta realized at that moment that they were talking about the man who was holding her hand tightly. David said thoughtfully that not having a maid must be very inconvenient for him, and he had absolutely no idea what was going through his brother's mind. Then he turned to Isaac and asked that they start looking again for a candidate for the role, for this could not go on any longer. He asked that they raise his wages in a statement. 5 gold pieces a week should be enough in his opinion. When Violetta heard this cost, she was very surprised and decided that it was even enough for her sister's treatment and many other things. She even thought about the fact that with that salary she could pay off her father's debt in a fairly short time. But the butler then said that earnings were not at all the most important issue in hiring people. David, rising immediately, inquired what the problem was then. Isaac, bowing, replied that they had no more volunteers left. There had been quite a rumor among all the employees, and there wasn't even a price that would motivate anyone to take care of Lord Theobald. Butler also added that even the serving staff members are talking about quitting their jobs soon, and have absolutely no intention of taking care of the man. When David heard this, he said that it was a difficult situation. He was about to add something else when Violetta interrupted him and apologized. She stepped forward and wondered if she could even get the job. She would be able to look after Lord Theobald and easily be a maid. The man, when he heard this, immediately thought about it. Then he turned to the lady and asked if it was true that she was from a noble family. The girl, a little embarrassed, replied that it was true. David, smiling, said that even though the world had turned upside down and the class system had indeed died a long time ago, it was still difficult for people like her to work at jobs for ordinary people. So he asked if she was sure she wanted it. Tears suddenly came to Violetta's eyes, and she thought of the fact that he was still thinking about the pride and status of a viscount's daughter. However, they have been completely irrelevant to her for a long time now. The moneylender from whom her father borrowed money was the most common man, and as long as there was money, the difference between classes no longer meant so much. After thinking about it for a bit, Violetta stepped forward and said that, as he himself had said, the world had changed, so it wouldn't make any difference if she, just one person, changed too. She was not breaking the law at all, so she had every right to work like everyone else. David, hearing this, smiled and apologized to her if he spoke completely out of turn and spoke rudely. But then suddenly the girl bowed and said that if they would forgive her, she should go home now, for she still had things to do. And just as she was about to turn around and leave, the man said that he had heard her, and he would be very happy to know that his brother was in good hands with a man like her. When Violetta heard this, she was immediately delighted and thanked him from the bottom of her heart, saying that it was very important to her. She was indeed very happy that she had managed to get the job after all. But then suddenly David turned to Isaac and asked that he alert the maid of honor to prepare training for this lady. The butler, bowing, said it would be done, and then departed, leaving them alone. Then the man rose from his seat and, moving closer to Violetta, inquired if she was of the River family. They talked for a while, and then the girl changed into her work uniform. She looked quite beautiful in it, and even one could say, luxurious. Violetta tried to mentally prepare herself for this job and was even a little worried. However, she knew she could handle it all, so it wasn't worth her worry at all. If she didn't get the job, even the horrible and small house she had would soon be taken away, and she would have to survive on the streets of the city with her sister. When the girl knocked and entered the room and apologized for the disturbance, she immediately went inside, and when she saw the man lying on the bed, she even froze. The girl did not expect to see a man completely naked and was ready to scream with horror, because this sight was unusual. But she still managed to restrain herself. Violetta was actually seeing a man naked for the first time in her life, and she was just lucky that some places were still covered. But after calming down a bit, she wondered what he could eat to have such a smooth and muscular back, and yet it was still pretty small. Then suddenly Theobald woke up and turned around to see her. He immediately realized what was happening, but when he noticed the girl, he smiled. The man immediately recognized her and said she was, after all, the girl he had previously dated. Violetta felt very uncomfortable. and he called her the girl with the apple. Then he reached forward and asked her to come closer to him for a moment. When she heard this, she was immediately embarrassed and didn't know if she should, but he, still lying on the bed, asked that she hurry up. Violetta realized that she had to do absolutely everything she was told, because she was his maid in this case. So she had no choice but to move even closer to his bed. As soon as Theobald saw this, he immediately put his arm around her waist and pulled her to him on the bed. The girl couldn't help herself and fell right on top of him. Violetta felt very awkward and didn't understand what was going on. Violetta felt very uncomfortable and didn't understand what was going on. For a while they lay there and just looked at each other, but then the man turned to her and asked her to look at something behind him. The girl didn't immediately realize what he meant, but when she looked behind his back, she saw a basket of apples. He kept smiling and said she could eat as much as she wanted. He sat down on the bed and Violetta wondered if she could have them all. The man smiled happily and said, of course, because they were hers now. He took one apple from the basket, saying that he had told his servants that he had gone apple picking last night, and so they had brought him a whole basket, and he certainly can't eat such a large quantity on his own. So he needs her help. Then he held out the fruit to the girl and asked her to eat it and not to be shy, not at all. Violetta looked at the apples in surprise. Then she looked at Theobald and thanked him for it. She then greedily sunk her teeth into the juicy and sweet apple, savoring its incredible flavor. And the man, observing all this, immediately smiled, and after that he asked if she liked it. When Violetta saw his expression, she lowered her head down and saw that she had accidentally covered him with juice. She felt bad about it and said that the apple was really good, fresh and sweet, and apologized to him for slobbering, saying she would clean it up. But the man replied that there was no harm in it, so she need not worry. She then remembered that she had to fulfill her duties, so she got up from his bed. The girl smiled happily and said her name, and added that she would be his maid from this day forward. She also added that she would try to make his conditions as good as possible and serve very well. Therefore, she asked that he should by no means hesitate to speak up if he needed anything. Theobald smiled when he heard this and said it sounded perfect. The girl was a little confused about what he was talking about and wondered if he meant an apple. Then she took her bitten apple and said that she had already taken a bite of it, so she suggested that he try another one, so that it would be right. The man immediately said that he would not refuse. Violetta replied that she would take some and cut them up to make them easier for him to eat. And just as she was about to head for the basket of apples, he suddenly grabbed her hand and immediately started taking a bite out of her apple. Because he did it rather quickly and even greedily, all the juice began to run down the girl's arm. She immediately felt everything getting sticky. But the man apologized, said it was his fault, and taking the apple out of her hands, began licking it so the juice wouldn't stain her again. Violetta was very surprised when she felt it. She blushed with embarrassment and asked him not to do it. But he even started nibbling on one of her fingers at this point, saying that the rag was too far away so it was easier to do it this way. Oh, and besides, it's much faster, so she shouldn't worry about it. Violetta immediately said that she was really fine and he didn't have to do that, but Lourdes didn't stop. So she pulled her hand out, unable to stand it, and said that she had asked him to stop. The girl felt very wrong and didn't understand. Was he really so crazy that he wasn't even ashamed of all this? She didn't understand how he could do such things so shamelessly. But then suddenly he put his hand to her cheek and said that he was really sorry. Then Theobald, smiling, added that from now on he was really counting on her and her professionalism. The girl just stared at him for a while, trying to contain her anger at the whole situation. But afterward she bowed and said she looked forward to working for him. She blushed all red and thought at that moment that it was rather strange and definitely confused her. But it wasn't as bad as she'd expected. Violetta thought he was so out of sorts that he would kill her or do something bad to her the first time they met. But everything had been peaceful, so she assumed that maybe he wasn't as bad as everyone said he was. Time flew by quite quickly, and from the moment she started working, the fears she had at the beginning were already starting to seem very silly to her. Walking through the garden one afternoon, Violetta picked a few lilies that looked and smelled just fine, and she really hoped Lord Theobald would like them. It had been a few days since she had arrived at the manor in order to work, and being inside the mansion, she could hear rumors about Lord Theobald far more often than she had when she lived at her place. Because of this, Violetta stood uncomfortable, for many people said that he had completely lost his mind and that he could kill a man easily. Violetta felt just awful at such moments, for she worked with him quite closely, and sometimes these rumors frightened her. And to distract herself a little, she picked a few bunches of flowers, hoping they might cheer him up just a little. As she looked around, she realized that she should hurry up and go back, for she had gone too far and they might already be looking for her. Violetta left him when he was asleep, so he could wake up at any moment and immediately start looking for her. Suddenly, as she passed by, she heard someone talking nearby. When she came closer, she saw that it was Lord David and Isaac, the butler, talking. David asked if the preparations for the inheritance ceremony were going smoothly. The man replied that of course everything was going as it should. The butler also added that His Majesty had given his full consent and that the Earl would be present as a representative, and the church would send a priest for its part. Well, then he wondered what they should do in the end with Lord Theobald's behavior. David sighed heavily, said that he had already and completely forgotten about his unfortunate older brother. But he said that he didn't understand anything and was just happy to have some girl around. He also added that this woman has lasted much longer than he expected, but he thinks the rumors have already spread enough, so he may not have to worry anymore. Isaac agreed with him and said that even those who believed Lord Theobald would regain his memory had already turned their backs on him, so this woman should be next. After that, he also added that the Count's daughter, according to him, is still insisting that he give his consent to the marriage, saying that if she takes care of him diligently, he will definitely come to his senses and remember everyone. David only laughed, saying that there was no way she was going to give up her hope for it anyway. Violetta, who was standing off to the side, immediately realized that the woman who was holding out well was her, and those two directly unashamedly discussing the fact that David's brother would never be cured and would remain insane all the time. But then suddenly the girl heard a strange sound not far from her. It was a snake crawling black as night. When Violetta saw her, she couldn't even contain her horror and started screaming loudly. But at that moment, someone came up to her from behind and immediately covered her mouth with his hand. The girl was very surprised that she was even confused. But when she turned her head to the side, she saw that the man in question was Theobald. He moved closer to her and told her to keep her voice down. The conversation between his brother and the butler continued. Isaac told Lord David that he only needed to focus on the inheritance ceremony anyway, and making sure everything went smoothly was precisely his job. For a while the man pondered. After that he said that he was indeed right, and they should do so. Soon after that they left each to go about their own business. Once Violetta heard that they had gotten far enough away, she could finally exhale in relief, and thought about the fact that they had almost gotten caught. But then suddenly she remembered the man standing next to her, and immediately turning to him, she wondered how he had gotten here in the first place. Lord Theobald replied that she was out of sight, and he had been told that she was in the garden, so he went in search of her. When she heard this, she immediately replied that she was about to head back to the manor, when she suddenly heard this conversation. Violetta also wondered if he had also heard everything they had said. She didn't know whether to comfort him or to be angry together, and all because his expression remained completely unperturbed. It was even harder for her to understand how he felt. They stood in silence for some time. Then the man turned to Violetta and said that he wanted to show her something. When the girl heard this, she was a little surprised, and he told her to follow him. Soon after that it began to get dark outside, and they went deep into the forest. When the girl saw this marvelous place, she could not even believe that it was really real. It was unbelievably beautiful. When Lord Theobald came closer, he asked her if she liked it. She stood there, not even taking her eyes off the view, and said it was very beautiful indeed. He sat down on a rock that was near the shore, and the girl sat down beside him. Theobald said that no one would come to this place, for only he knew of its existence. Violetta then inquired how it could be so beautiful, and the man explained that there was a large lake to the east, and it was very close to the mansion. Everyone talks about it being the most beautiful place in the county. However, in his personal opinion, where they passed is much more beautiful than this popular place. He smilingly also added that his mother always liked to be in solitude with herself on this beautiful shore. When Violetta heard this, she looked at him in surprise, for for she knew that his mother had died 5 years ago, and she immediately felt sad about it. And all because her mom had died too. And all her few memories were slowly fading away from her. And all that was left was the pain that was occasionally unnoticeable. They were silent for a while. And then the girl said that her mother had died when she was very young too. At the last moment she asked her to take care of her sister, and since then the girl has been sick to this day. That's why she was very eager to fulfill her mother's request. After the fall of their kind, one could not seriously trust the sympathy and pity of the people who kept saying they understood her. At that time there were also those who rushed to laugh at their family's pain, and Violetta always understood, so she could not even share her feelings and experiences with anyone. She was silent for some time. Then she said that on the day she went to the market, the thing she had sold for money to buy medicine for her sister was the last memory of her dear mother. It was a beautiful ring that was as dear to Violetta as a memory. Well, then suddenly she smiled and apologized to the man, saying that it was rather unexpected, and she didn't want to talk about such a sad thing right now. But Theobald reached forward at that moment and asked her to come closer to him. The girl was a little surprised, not understanding why he wanted her to do that, but she complied. He also told her to stand in front of him, and when she did, he smiled and said that the weather was already pretty warm, so it was okay. At that moment, Violetta began to worry. She wondered what he was up to, but she didn't even have time to finish the sentence, when suddenly he pushed her with his hand right in her stomach, and the girl began to fall into the water. She screamed loudly, for she had not at all expected this and could not even rise to the surface. The water was enveloping her deeper and deeper against her. Violetta was very disturbed and didn't understand what had happened. She assumed that he was probably angry that she hadn't comforted him, instead starting to tell him about her problems. She was sinking further and further and realized that she couldn't get out or even breathe. She wanted to ask for help, but realized it was useless, because no one would hear her underwater. And just as she was beginning to lose consciousness, she felt someone grab her arm. It was Theobald, of course. He pulled her outside and told her to calm down. The girl, closing her eyes, kept apologizing and also said that she had said a lot of unnecessary things. But he, smiling, replied that everything was fine and she shouldn't worry about it. The girl's whole body began to shake with fear, and he told her not to be afraid, for he held her tightly. When she heard these words, she looked at him in surprise. Lord replied that they were on the shore, which meant it was fairly shallow, so she shouldn't worry. She should just relax. Violetta then asked if he had not pushed her because he was angry. The man replied that of course he had not. They stood waist-deep in the water, and Violetta looked down and said that the water was not cold at all, to her surprise. He then, smiling, inquired if she happened to feel a little calmer afterward. The girl, on reflection, said, "I guess I'm really better for him." And he replied that that was very good indeed. He likes this place, and when he comes here, he feels much calmer at heart. Violetta looked him straight in the eye and wondered, is it all because this place was his mother's favorite? But Theobald said nothing to that. He just hugged her so tightly that she couldn't even breathe. When she told him that, he moved away from Violetta, and she saw the wet t-shirt clinging to his muscular body. The girl immediately began to feel very uncomfortable. She didn't understand why they were so close, so she decided to try to push him away. But it was no use, for he was looking at her in a way that made him seem incredibly sad. When she looked more closely, she noticed that tears were streaming down his eyes. Violetta couldn't believe that he was really showing his true emotions, and she immediately wanted to hug him. But in response, she only told him not to be sad, because everything would be all right. The man then inquired in surprise, "Do I seem sad to you?" The girl then started talking quite loudly and apologized for being very impolite. She just thought so she decided to support him a little. Violetta explained that when she was very young and her mother died, her father told her that if she really loves with all her heart, even when you let go of a person, you will never lose them forever, and that person will definitely stay in your heart. She smiled and also added that he would forever live and breathe in this place, so that one could love him with his beautiful and boundless soul all his life. Theobald frowned upon hearing this, then wondered, does it really work even if there was only love on one side? Violetta, hearing this, looked at him in surprise and asked, What is he even talking about? The man put her hand to his heart, and she felt his heartbeat at that moment. They stood and were silent. But then suddenly the man started squeezing her hand even harder, and she said she was in pain. When the guy didn't let go of her, she quickly pulled her hand out and punched him back. Theobald was very surprised to see this. After that, he became very stern and said that he was tired of bathing, so they had better go home. Without thinking, he took the girl in his arms. Violetta did not expect this and immediately began to pull away. She said that she was able to walk on her own and that he could let her go. But the man replied that the place was home to many different snakes and inquired if she really wanted him to let her go. When she heard that, she said of course not, and hugged him hard so she wouldn't even look under her feet where there might be snakes, which she was incredibly afraid of. Theobald smiled happily, and soon afterward they set off in the direction of the manor to rest already, for it had grown quite dark outside. The next morning, David asked the butler to summon Violetta to him. And as soon as she came in, he asked her what she could do for him. In fact, she still couldn't forget what she'd heard the previous day, and she didn't understand why he would call her out on it. But David then, with a sly smile, told her to listen to him carefully, and also added that what he was about to tell her should remain just between them, and no one else should know about it. The girl was a little surprised at this, but said that of course she understood everything, and would not tell anyone else. He inquired if he was correct in knowing that she, Violetta Rivera, was the eldest daughter of Frederick Rivera and Angela, and her little 7-year-old sister suffers from an incredibly large heart condition. When Violetta heard this information, she was very surprised. But David went on and said his mother had been killed by demons about 10 years ago, and his father had run away after racking up more debt. He also said that he had heard that the principal debts alone amounted to very many thousands of gold, not counting the interest, which still continued to rise every day. Violetta immediately became worried. She couldn't believe that he questioned her origins, so he decided to find out some information. Then in her defense, she said that she planned to pay off little by little the debts her father had left behind, and that's why she took this job, to do it as soon as possible. But the man interrupted her and said that the previous maid had stolen the Countess's jewelry, and he wondered how he could even trust her in such a financial situation. Violetta immediately moved closer to him and replied that she would never even think of stealing someone else's money. It was really true. She wanted to earn in order to pay her debts personally. So the girl began to beg him very strongly not to kick her out, because she really needed that money. She knew very well that as a person who was too young and without work experience, there was no place that would take her in and pay her enough to pay back her debts with interest. And she had to buy her sister's medicine too. She was even willing to get on her knees and said she would do absolutely anything he wanted. So she begged him not to kick her out. David, hearing this, was immediately interested and said that since she was willing to do anything, he would give her one chance. He came closer to her and said that most of the maids who had worked before had left after a couple of days, because they couldn't stand it all. But since she had been among them for a long time, it meant that he must have taken a liking to her. That was why he had asked that she seduce Theobald by any means possible, use even her own body if need be. When Violetta heard this, she wondered what it was that he was even saying, for she had not expected that he could ask such a thing of her. But David, with a smile on his face, inquired, "Isn't she up to the job?" The girl clutched her dress tighter and thought about the fact that he was well aware that this was an order and she had to follow it, and he wanted to use her to create a weakness in her brother. From what she'd overheard in the woods recently by chance, she realized that David wanted to get rid of Count Pocklum's daughter, who had been loyal to Theobald. And even if Violetta got it right, she simply had no other choice. So, with her head down, she agreed to his request and said she could fulfill everything. David smiled smugly and said she was good and understood when to act. As Violetta walked out the door, she thought about the fact that she needed to remember to take care of herself and her little sister, because she was in no position to feel sorry for anyone or help anyone. But at that moment, she suddenly heard a strange sound not far from her. When she turned her head to the side, she saw Theobald standing in front of her, next to a broken vase, The man looked rather angry, and he wondered where she had been disappearing to without his permission. Violetta didn't understand what was going on, and as he continued to scream, he pointed his finger at her and told her to get out of his sight, because he didn't want to ever see her again. The girl, hearing this, was ready to cry, but she gathered her courage and bent down to pick up the shards, asking him to move away. Theobald didn't expect to hear such a thing and wondered what she meant, and the girl explained that the vase had broken, and it might be too dangerous, so he'd better get away from it. He looked at her angrily and said that he had told her to leave, after all, so she should follow his orders. Violetta sighed heavily and continued picking up the shards, and said she would leave as soon as she had treated his leg wound and applied ointment, bandaging it. He could barely stand still due to the fact that all of his legs were covered in blood and wounds. However, he wondered who she was. Violetta replied in a calm voice that she was his maid and this was her job, so she was definitely not leaving until she had done it. She also, smiling, asked if he could step back, in order that she could clean up the splinters and help him soon. Several hours had passed since then. It had gotten quite dark outside, and it was only by then that the girl had finally finished cleaning everywhere and treated all of his wounds. She also brought warm milk with honey and brioche for him, but the man, still lying in bed, replied that he did not want all that, so he asked that she carry it. Violetta began to insist and asked that he at least eat a little, for he had not had a single meal that day. He replied in an indignant voice that he had a great appetite. The girl didn't understand what he was saying, so she asked him what he meant. Theobald didn't even look her in the eye, and told her that she wanted to escape from this place so badly after all, so she might as well not hold back, and he wouldn't hold her back from leaving. The girl suddenly started to get angry too, because she didn't understand why his behavior had changed so drastically, but she said she was definitely not going anywhere. When he heard this, he smiled and finally looked at her and wondered, does she really need money that badly? Violetta decided not to hide anything from him, and said that it was really true, and she did not just need them, but fatally needed them. She has a sick sister to support, and as the eldest, she can't quit her job. So no matter how much he wants to, she won't quit until David fires her. The man then said that he didn't understand at all how she could spend money on a disease that could hardly even be cured. After all, it was like pouring water into a leaky jug. He asked with a smile on his face if it wouldn't be better to just leave everything and run away. When she heard this, she immediately started laughing loudly. Theobald looked at her in surprise and wondered what he had said that was so funny. But she keeps laughing, said not at all. It's just that her sister was really saying the same words. Her younger sister's name was Rayana, and she too had told Violetta about how when the body is sick, it's already sick, so you get irritated, feed yourself, and even cry from your own suffering. The man eyed Violetta suspiciously and wondered what she was answering her then. The girl wondered, does he really think he should have answered? Because she didn't think so she just slapped him on the back, and that was the end of it. When Theobald heard this, he looked at her in surprise and couldn't believe that she was actually saying such a thing. Then he turned away and sighed heavily. Violetta said it was the first time she'd ever seen someone sigh so heavily, and wondered if he was just uncomfortable eating, and if there was anything she could do to help him. The man replied that since she was staying anyway, he would like to take a bath. Violetta was immediately pleased that he finally allowed her to help, and said that she would prepare everything immediately. The girl immediately went to the bathroom and drew a whole tub of warm water. She wasn't sure if it was the right temperature. She kept touching the water with her hand to see if it would be okay. Some time passed and she came out to the man and told him that everything was ready. Theobald walked into the room, which was filled with smoke from the hot bath, and turning to the girl, requested that she undress him. When Violetta heard this, she looked at him in surprise and asked what he meant. The man, turning to her, replied that in order to wash, one must undress, and wondered why she was just standing there. One should get down to business already, for he wanted to take a bath. The girl was confused about the whole thing. She apologized and said it was just her first time in the bathing room. Then she reached out to take off his shirt, but he quickly intercepted her. Theobald wrapped his arms around her waist and pulled her close to him, telling her to come closer and serve properly. Violetta felt very uncomfortable about the whole thing, and with trembling hands she began to slowly unbutton his shirt. The man smiled as he saw her face turn red and said that he thought she was perky and brave, but it turned out she was a coward. She felt very uncomfortable, but she realized that there was no way she should give in to such provocations. After all, he just wanted to get some kind of reaction from her. It would amuse him. She had already reached the bottom buttons and could see his abs. Then her hands trembled even more. She didn't like what was happening because she thought it was only necessary to prepare the bath. Theobald smiled happily, moved closer to her, and whispered in a quiet voice in her ear that from the outside it might look like he was about to eat her on the spot. The girl immediately remembered his brother's words that she should seduce him by any means necessary. But it was all too awkward for Violetta, so she moved farther away from him and told him she wasn't a brioche for him to eat. The man moved even closer to her and inquired, "Is that so? But to know if it has the flavor of this dish, one must first taste it, in his opinion." Then she immediately slapped his chest with her palms, telling him that she had already undone everything so he could take it from there. The man, smug, started to take off his shirt and wondered why she was suddenly blushing so much. Was this really the first time she was seeing a naked man in her life? Then he inquired whether she had already made her debut in high society or not yet. Violetta looked away from him as far as she could, and said that she had not yet done so. They are only called Viconian, but in reality, they are no different from the commoners. In fact, at one time her father really wanted to make her debut, but going public required a lot of money and connections, which they certainly didn't have enough of. That's why he ended up taking on an excessive amount of business in an attempt to make money, and only ended up going into huge debts. Soon afterward, Theobald finally undressed and climbed into the hot bath. The girl sat beside him and thought that it would be better if her father had done this for the sake of his own career. Then she would be able to hate him in peace. Some time had passed since then, and the girl inquired if the man would like her to heat his water for him, for in her opinion it had already gotten a little cold. The man sighed heavily and said she had some strange expression on her face again. Violetta looked at him in surprise and asked what he even meant, for she really didn't understand it. Theobald looked away from her and said she had that look in her eyes, as if she were carrying the burdens of the world on her shoulders alone. She laughed nervously and wondered if he really thought she was like that. The man started looking at the water and said that when your head is a mess, sometimes it helps to take a dip with your head somewhere. He then shifted his gaze to her and said with a smile on his face that if she wanted to distract herself, she could even climb into his bathtub. He certainly wouldn't mind that. Violetta was confused when she heard this and wondered if he really wanted her to get in there, but the man even extended his hand to her. He asked her why she was suddenly so embarrassed. Because they had already bathed together once, but she protested and told him not to say that, because it wasn't true. She explained that it wasn't a bathroom, but a lake with lots of people swimming in it, and yes, plus they were fully clothed. Theobald smiled and wondered what difference it made at all, since he couldn't see her personally, and added that if she kept blushing like that, people might actually think something. Violetta couldn't believe that now his biggest amusement was that he would tease her constantly about anything. Well then, looking up, she said that if he stayed in this place too long he might even get dizzy, and wondered if it was time for him to get out. The man thought for a bit and said that it was indeed true. The water had already started to cool down by then, so he immediately got to his feet. Theobald was completely naked, so the girl could see all his exposed spots, and also quite close. Violetta could not even look away, for she was very surprised at such behavior and tried to keep her gaze as far away from that intimate place as possible. They stood in silence for a while, and then the man said that since she'd had enough, could she hand him a towel after all? She immediately apologized to him and, taking a towel, began wiping his back from the droplets that were left on it. But then suddenly, looking more closely, she saw some scratches on his side and even stopped to look at them more closely. When the man saw her look, he immediately inquired if it was true that it looked pretty much creepy, and also added with a smile on his face that he had almost died in that accident. Violetta was a little embarrassed, immediately uncomfortable with this conversation. But she said that the scars were incredibly deep, so they probably wouldn't even heal. He suddenly straightened his back and said that every time he remembered that, so immediately his ribs started to whimper. Then the girl turned to him in a trembling voice and told him that she had also heard that he had bumped his head normally like that too. The man looked at her suspiciously and said that it was indeed true. The doctors even said that if the rib had gone in even a fingernail's thickness deeper, he would have died. So the very fact that he survived is the biggest miracle of all. Violetta was surprised to hear all these stories. It was hard for her to realize that he could talk so calmly about such serious things. Those deep scars of Lord Theobald's are like stitches that were carelessly placed on a broken doll. She was silent for a while, and then she said she couldn't even imagine how much pain he must have been in at that moment. But the man kept smiling and said that no matter how one imagines it, it will only get worse. He added that sometimes he thought it would have been better if he had died at all. It would have been much easier. When the girl heard this, she immediately started yelling at him and told him never to say that, if only for the sake of those who were glad he had survived safely. She asked that he not even think of such a thing. Theobald, hearing this, looked at her in surprise and wondered who could be at all happy about such a thing. He then snatched the towel from her hands and asked if she thought there were any such people in this world at all. He immediately began to cover his seats and leave, and the girl wondered what he meant, for she really didn't understand why he was saying all this. As he finally disappeared into the walls of the room, the girl paused and thought about how at times like this, he reminded her incredibly much of her sister Reimke. When Violetta was still living with her sister, she kept screaming and saying that it would be better if she died, because then it would be much easier for everyone. But Violetta did not want to hear anything like that, and said that she had promised her sister not to say such words, because she knew that it was not true. Raima said afterwards that a neighbor told her that if it had not been for her, Violetta would have been successfully married long ago and lived very well. Violetta put her hand on her sister's arm and said that the neighbor was definitely wrong, and asked if her sister remembered their childhood promise. They had sworn that they would always be together, and it was unbearable for Violetta to hear her sister speak like that. Violetta also said that they had also decided to plant a small apple tree in front of the house, and when it bore fruit, they would bake fancy pies from those apples. As she looks at Lord Theobald, she is reminded of Raima, and it becomes heavy on her heart, both of them blaming themselves for their illnesses. Shortly after Violetta finished tidying up the bathroom, she went into the man's room and inquired if he was still awake. He was already in bed at that point, and without even turning toward her, he asked what else she suddenly needed. Sss. Violetta came closer to him and said that she had behaved very tactlessly during the day, and that was why she had come to apologize to him. And he immediately sat down on his bed and, touching his head, began to rub it, for he had a severe headache. Violetta immediately ran to him and asked what she could do to help him. Theobald pondered for a while, and then grabbed her by the arm and pulled her into his bed, telling her not to go anywhere until he was asleep. The girl, hearing this, was very surprised and wanted to object, but immediately remembered David's words and agreed to it. Violetta lay down beside him and said that in that case, she would be there until he fell asleep, and then she would go straight back to her place. The man stared at her for a while, and afterwards said that it had been as impenetrable a night on the day of the carriage accident, just as it had been at that moment. He was looking at the ceiling, and Violetta was looking at him intently. The man said it was pouring rain, and it was incredibly dark, so dark that you couldn't even see a single leaf on the tree. After receiving the news that his father had suddenly passed out, he immediately rushed to him and ended up in this terrible accident. His body pierced the stump of the carriage as it rolled over, and the world spun before his eyes. And after that day, everything turned upside down and was never the same. In just a month, from the promising eldest son of Dan's family, this perfect in every way, he could turn into a victim of an accident who lost absolutely everything because of it. He suddenly clenched his hand into a fist and told the girl through gritted teeth that he had only spent a month in this pitch darkness before he woke up. All the people around him claimed it was a miracle to wake up in a month, but to him it seemed like the truest eternity. And since then, he has really come to hate the night with all his soul. Every night he cannot sleep for fear that he will never wake up again in that darkness. Theobald, giving himself a slap on the face, sighed heavily and told the girl that he had now gone from the beautiful, handsome man that everyone wanted to marry to an idiot who had even forgotten how to sleep properly. Violetta, when she heard this touching and heartwarming story, realized that it was now quite unsurprising that Lorda had become so hysterical. His father, the Count, is also not well and is undergoing treatment, and the only family left is his younger brother. Oh, and he's also the one who keeps bullying him in order to inherit the title and frame his older brother. Yes, and Violet herself realized that she was no better either, using his position to stay only in this job. Yes, and accepted this terrible offer from David. After that, the girl sat on the bed and said that it wasn't his fault at all, so he shouldn't hate himself like that. The man smiled when he heard that, and after that he began to hug her. He smelled her neck and said that she smelled nice. Violetta started to pull away from him, but he said it was much better than he would have bitten. She asked that he stop fooling around and go to bed already, and he in turn, smiling, told her to do her best in that case. Then she ran her hand through his hair, laid back on the pillow and began humming some kind of tune. Theobald, when he heard the song, wondered what it was all about. He had never heard anything like it before. The girl explained that it was a lullaby that her mother always sang to her with her sister when they couldn't sleep. After that, she continued humming the different words and melody. A lot of time passed from then on, and Violetta eventually fell asleep herself, and the man was not an eye in the world. He smiled, fixed his hair, and said that if it wasn't his fault, then who did he have to blame in that case? Just like that, the night passed. Violetta began to wake up a little because of the sun, which was shining directly into her eyes. And Theobald, watching this, was very surprised, for he woke up before she did. Theobald was surprised to see her awake before she was, and his ego was hurt, because she was sleeping pretty soundly. But the man turned around and started to leave the room, thinking that at least he had gotten some sleep after all. At that moment, someone knocked on their door, and the man was very surprised that someone had come so early. As soon as he opened the door, he saw a guy with red hair who looked worried. Theobald led him inside and indicated with a single gesture that he should keep his voice down so as not to wake the girl. Once they got inside, he also inquired, "What happened, and why did you suddenly show up so early? There is absolutely no education and respect at all." Guy then said that the Lord wasn't asleep anyway, so he didn't see the point in swearing like that. Theobald smiled as he turned around and told Cain that this was exactly why he was saying he had absolutely no upbringing, since he couldn't even answer properly. When Cain shifted his gaze to the bed, he saw some girl there and wondered who she even was. The man looked at him in surprise and asked, "Have you had a chance to look around the room yet?" And then made a surprised voice and said that, of course, it's so unusual for a sick person to have a private life. Cain objected and inquired, "Do you even have the strength to fool around where enemies are all around?" He thought about the fact that still, and this time she was a spy that would have been planted by the Devon. He started yelling loudly, asking, "Did his brother slip him a new rat to sniff out everything again?" Theobald said it certainly couldn't be called a rat, but rather a cowardly squirrel. The boy looked at the gentleman in surprise and wondered what he meant by that. He smiled and said that he was not supposed to know, so it was better not to ask any more questions. Theobald then turned to him and inquired, "Why did you even come so early?" Tayan immediately replied that they had apparently decided to get into action after all. He started shouting loudly, saying that things were getting heated. Violetta, who was sleeping soundly, started to wake up anyway because of the loud noises, and started twisting from side to side. Cain continued to yell and told the Lord that it was time for him to make a decision, for otherwise it might be too late. But Theobald heard that Violetta was completely awake, so he grabbed his friend by the head and threw him just out the window. The girl, when she woke up, immediately saw him and said hello, and the man, wiping some stain on the glass, said that he wanted to close the window because of the draft, but it ended up slamming shut on its own. And at the same moment, he was looking through the window at his friend who was hiding there, and trying to tell him not to even make a sound. Violetta was a little surprised when she heard this story, but afterwards she suddenly got off the bed and said that it was too late. And apologizing, she said that she shouldn't have fallen asleep first. The man walked closer to her and looked her straight in the eye and told her that she was so sound asleep that she didn't even think about what he might have done to her at that time. When she heard that, she was immediately angry and really hoped that nothing like that had happened. And also the girl was worried that she might have done something wrong that she should start to regret. But Theobald suddenly began to laugh loudly, and when Violetta heard this, she asked irritably, "Is he teasing her again?" The man did not answer clearly, but smiled and said that no one knew that after all. He started pouring water into the glass and said that he was just kidding this time. However, next time anything could happen. Violetta blushed angrily and said that next time she wouldn't believe him. Afterward, she asked him if he'd gotten any sleep. The gentleman replied that he had only gotten a little bit. He then handed her a cup of water, asking if she was thirsty by any chance. The girl held out her hands to take the cup and thanked him, telling him she wouldn't mind a sip. But as soon as the man came closer to her, he was about to hand over the cup. But then he quickly changed his mind and started drinking right in front of her nose. He took a few sips of water into his mouth, and afterward he moved closer to Violetta and passed the water into the girl's mouth while kissing her. She was very surprised at what was happening, and when she realized, she immediately started pushing him away from her and screaming loudly. To the girl, such behavior was simply inappropriate, and she began to swear at the Lord, saying that she couldn't even breathe. Theobald, wiping the remnants of water from her face, asked if she happened to want another sip. He moved closer to her again and, smiling, said it was her punishment for being the first to fall asleep. Violetta continued to swear and said that next time she wanted him to give advance warning because she was freaking out. She then got out of bed and started to make it, thinking that if she stayed even a little longer, there was no telling what else he might want to do to her. She took the blanket in her hands and said she would go and shake him out better. Violetta was incredibly annoyed, and when she went out into the corridor, she walked very fast, thinking about the fact that this man always does what he wants, and she now felt very sorry that she had pitied him for even a moment. Still, in terms of seducing Lord Theobald, it could be said that she had even succeeded a little, which meant that David's request was slowly beginning to be fulfilled. As she walked outside, she remembered the man starting to kiss her. She had rather mixed feelings about it. The girl ran outside and thought about the fact that she would at least go and beat the blanket from the heart, throwing all her anger out there. At this very time, not far from the manor, David stood with one maid and told her to keep still and shut up at last. The poor maid was crying over what was happening, but David, moving closer to her, motioned for her to turn around and lean against a tree. The maid immediately repeated it, and then the man began to pull up her skirt. She pretended to like it, but she really didn't. And after that, David started to make love to her, but it was all very hard and fast. The poor maid even felt the pain of it. Violetta walked past all this, and when she saw it, she just froze in place. She felt very uncomfortable, for she thought there was no one in the street at this hour. The girl couldn't understand why she had to run into him at this particular time and place. Then she quickly turned around and started to walk away, thinking that she needed to be calm and just go somewhere else before they noticed her. David heard some strange rustling in the bushes, and when he turned his head to the side, he saw that it was Violetta running away. He immediately turned to her and told her to stop immediately. The girl did not immediately realize that he was addressing her and assumed that he had probably not noticed her and was talking to another maid. But he became very rude and turned to Violetta and said that he had ordered her to stop. Then he asked her if she dared to disobey his order. The maid, who was still standing in a very uncomfortable position for her, turned to David and replied that she hadn't done anything, had she? But the man was very angry. He immediately punched her in the face and started zipping his pants back up. He started yelling at the girl, telling her to leave as soon as possible. The maid looked at him in surprise and asked what he meant. David looked at her menacingly and said that he was very annoyed by her stupidity, so he asked her not to make him more angry, for he would be sorry. The maid immediately started to run away and said that she would do no such thing. Then David turned to Violetta and started talking to her. He said he had sent her to spy on his brother as far back as he could remember, and wondered why, in that case, she had suddenly started following him. Violetta was very surprised, and said that she had certainly not intended to peep, but had just been looking for a place to shake out the blanket, and had stumbled upon it quite by accident. David looked at her irritably, and asked why she had to carry the blanket all the way out there. He even came closer to her at that moment, and she was a little afraid, for she had seen how he had treated the previous maid so badly. He smiled smugly and said that she must have had fun with his brother all night long on that blanket.